This is the Mitakon 65 1.4, a fairly legendary lens in the digital medium format game, but this is their new 80mm f1.6. Now, there are some differences and a lot of similarities, so let's check it out. Now, they sent over this lens for the sake of this review. I believe I do actually get to keep it, but no money changed hands. They're definitely not seeing this video before it gets published. So as I'm sure you'll see in this video, my thoughts are definitely my own. Now, obviously, if you're looking at this thing, you're going to be going, okay, cool. So Hasselblad has an 80mm f1.9. Fujifilm has an 80mm f1.7. So this is just the same thing, except for significantly cheaper, no autofocus, and ever so slightly faster. Now, right off the bat, obviously, I'm reviewing this in the Hasselblad X2D mount. For people that have used that system, the newest versions, so the 907X100C and the X2D, both have a mode on them that instead of shooting at 16-bit RAWs, you can shoot at 14-bit RAWs, which allows the sensor to read out a little bit faster and make it more snappy, which basically allows you, for the most part, to shoot things like portraits and stuff that's not quick moving at all, because this camera and the X2D do not have an internal shutter. They rely on the lenses of their XCD lenses. Those have a leaf shutter inside of them, and so that's kind of where you would possibly run into some issues. Now, this obviously is going to be for the Fuji G mount, like the GFX cameras. So all of those are going to be able to take this lens with absolutely no issues. All of those cameras have their own shutters. So rolling shutter and things like that are going to be no issue for those. But as I have this camera, I have since sold off my GFX 50S because they were definitely redundant. But I wanted to throw that out there as kind of a small caveat to the Hasselblad cameras in particular. Now, like I mentioned before, I have had this lens, the 65mm f1.4 version, for quite a while. I made a full review about it up here. You can see my images on the GFX as well as the 907X here. And what I really love about it is it gives you a very shallow depth of field in a sort of more normal focal length. So it's like a 50mm-ish. These cameras, all these digital medium format cameras, currently use a 4x3 sensor at 44x33-ish, which is different in terms of its aspect ratio to a typical 35mm sensor. I know I talk about this all the time, but it is one of the things that's going to differentiate and sort of make a focal length feel a little bit different because those aspect ratios don't exactly line up. But the typical conversion that most people do is a 0.79 conversion. That brings this 80mm to about a 63, I believe, and the 65mm to about a 51 or so. If you're thinking of an 80mm on a 645 body, you're not going to get that same field of view. It's going to be most closer to this, where this is going to be a lot closer to a 58mm equivalent, which is kind of the closest that I usually see on a full frame sensor. Now, in terms of the body and the build quality and things, these things are just absolute tanks. I've said it before about other things, but they are crazy heavy. Probably the biggest downside, honestly, of this lens in general is just that it is so heavy. But what I do appreciate about that is, for the most part, the larger size and weight means that I'm actually getting full coverage without a lot of vignetting. So it's something that's allowing the optics to be larger is going to project a larger image circle onto the sensor, which just makes things give you better image quality. You're not going to get a lot of the other issues that come with that. Now, one of the criticisms that I had about the Mitakon 65 was that the aperture ring wasn't clicked for some reason. And you will notice that on the new 80mm, it's ever so quiet, but you do get a click in there. I do wish that it was a little bit more of a click so that I don't accidentally bump it, because you can definitely very easily bump it because it also is in full stops. So I've definitely been using it and accidentally been kind of in between f1.6 and f2. Not that that's going to be that big of a difference, but it still is a thing. So if you want to, have your aperture at a certain thing, I do have to check it more often than I would like. So while it is an improvement over not having a click at all. It's getting closer there. We're moving in the right direction, at least. Now, there were a couple things about this lens that were a bit confounding to me. The first of which is that I get that they wanted to save space, I'm assuming, to keep it relatively compact when it is basically at infinity. But then as you focus, the entire lens barrel moves out a fairly significant amount. So what happens is that kind of just tosses things about a little bit. It changes the weight, but also you're physically moving all of this stuff as well. But because of that, it sometimes just gets a little bit less smooth because you're moving so much glass and so much stuff, including the whole outside barrel and everything. So that just makes it a little bit less appealing in terms of just getting quick focusing, because sometimes it's really easy and sometimes it's like a little bit harder. So it's just kind of an interesting little combination there. So speaking of how this thing focuses as well, I had asthma as a child, and well, I still do, but this reminds me of when I was a kid. So when you focus this thing in and out, you can hear it kind of like wheezing. So I've heard of focus breathing, but this is actually some focus breathing. So yeah, not that great. Now, the second sort of criticism I have as well is that while it has a hard stop at infinity, this lens goes beyond infinity, which I don't really know why. Someone had explained it to me at one time, but I just really want to be able to just like go to infinity and not have to like ever so slightly move it back. And I get that maybe at 1.6, but I don't know, like, what am I, if I'm photographing the stars, are they going to be at infinity there? I haven't really run into that at this point, and especially not on a lens like this. So just knowing that, like, let's say I'm going to use, you know, a landscape or something, I guess maybe at 5.6, it wouldn't be that big of an issue, but it's still things that normally I would use for infinity, even at 5.6, are still out of focus beyond things. So it feels like this lens goes a little bit beyond what the infinity focus should be for anything, for that matter. So it is a bit of an annoyance to want to focus on something far away, and then I have to go in, double tap, make sure that everything is actually in focus, which means that I have to move the lens ever so slightly. So a bit of an annoyance there. Now, this thing does actually come with a lens hood, but even when you do have the lens hood on, it has a lot of like weird ghosting from things that are coming in that aren't in the image. So it's just hitting the front of the element somewhere and then bouncing around. So there's a ton of times, even in that example that I have behind me, like I have this like little glow going around the outside of my body. And that's from light entering into the lens. Even with the lens hood on, I've tried it multiple times with and without the lens hood on. Obviously, the lens hood is going to be helpful and create less of that. But anytime some light can get in there, it bounces and gives you some really weird flaring from outside of the image that you're actually taking. Personally, I would assume that it's something that they would kind of have caught in production and things like that, because it seems like an oversight to release a lens that has that issue, because it's something that I have not figured out a way to get around, at least. I've tried putting my hand like over things, and the only way to do it is actually to like block it out. So it's not that I have an issue somewhere in the mount or somewhere else in the lens. It's just somehow hitting at the right angle. Again, even with the lens hood on at many times, I definitely saw it immediately, and then it was like, all right, well, maybe I'm just not using the hood. Put the hood on, and there were plenty of times where I was still getting that kind of weird ghosting on the sides of the image. So, I mean, personally, it's not a deal breaker. I think it looks kind of cool. It kind of feels almost, in times, it kind of gives the ghosting that I get when I have like ever so slight light leaks. But it's one of those things where it's like, if you don't like that, that's going to be very, very, very annoying really fast. Now, in terms of image quality, it's pretty fun for sure. It's not like the sharpest thing in the world. It just gives you that like medium format, shallow depth of field, and 1.6 on a medium format sensor. Again, timesing that by 0.79 to kind of get your 35mm look equivalent is like I think 1.25 or something like that. So it's not like wildly out of this world shallow, but it's definitely going to be something that for the most part is going to look a little bit more shallow and a little bit more detailed and things like that than most other 35mm lenses. So I think for me, at least, one of the things that I would obviously be thinking is this is definitely going to be like a budget lens. It's probably not for a lot of people going to be their primary lens. It's going to be a good portrait lens, but I know that a lot of people buy this lens, the 65. So I wanted to take some images side by side and kind of see the difference, see if that added bit of focal length is really going to make a huge difference in terms of depth of field and kind of overall look. And the thing I was like really, I guess not surprised by, but it makes a lot of sense if you really think about it, because you're essentially like narrowing your field of view at an 80mm versus a 65, but then you're kind of cutting down the light ever so slightly at a 1.6 versus a 1.4. Sticking these side by side, I was going, the out of focus elements almost look identical in both of these. Just one obviously is a little bit tighter. But if, let's say, I cropped the 80mm in to about the same field of view as a 65, it's pretty much identical. So here's kind of my take on it. I do appreciate the smaller weight. I don't really like that it zooms all the way out and, again, makes that weird kind of noise as it does that. The upgrade here in the clicked aperture is definitely useful and helpful, but unless you need like more reach and you want to get this because you have that extra reach beyond that, it doesn't make that much sense to me unless you just want to do everything in camera as well, not to just get the 65, to be honest. If you just crop the 65 and you get that exact same look, but then you also get a little bit wider, so you get a larger image, it's a little bit more versatile. Around a 50mm is going to be more classic. It's gonna, you know, just like, you kind of just get the same look that this is giving you out of this. And I definitely don't think that most people would need to buy both of these. That's why I think having like a 65mm and something like a 100, a 110, even like a 90 would be far enough of a differentiation over something like this. Now, if your main thing is like portraits or you have another wider lens that you want to pair with this, I think that's where this makes sense. But for someone like me, I kind of just like to use this as a kind of one lens system. That's why I either use this, the 65, and I had borrowed the 55, and I'm currently borrowing the 38mm from Hasselblad. But you can also see where these lenses are so much more expensive, and they are a little bit slower at 2.5 versus 1.4, 1.6. But the size difference is significant, and then you don't run into any of those other issues. So again, I guess one of the things would be like, let's say you had the 38 and you wanted a portrait lens, but you wanted something fast. That's where something like this could work really well. Or even if you had the 55 and you wanted something with a little more shallow depth of field, the 65 isn't going to be that much different from the 55. And let's say you just wanted to not have to spend the money on the new 90mm. This could be a way to get something really interesting, get you more shallow depth of field, all of those things. So again, I think that my take on this lens is I have some issues with it. I wouldn't make this my only lens for this system, but as an auxiliary lens, as a fun lens to add to your kit, this thing coming in at $600, especially for the GFX or the Hasselblad X mount, it's a cool lens. It's not a bad lens. It has some weird quirks for sure. But it, again, does better than me adapting a lot of my 35mm lenses on it as well. It was just a little bit disappointing in some areas, if I'm being honest. But it's probably because I hold this lens in such high regard, and the fact that it has sort of as many quirks as that one does as well was just kind of odd for me. So either way, if you are interested in this lens, I will put links in the description down below. You can check out my video on the 65mm up here. Check out my original video on the Hasselblad 907X up here, and I will see you in one of those videos.